let's go ahead and begin. So what we're going to focus on today is are a couple of things. Who the gifted are, how do we identify them, what do they look like, how can we find them through tools and measures, how can we provide programming and services for them, and maybe ways that we can implement programming for these kids. So this is all based on the new law, which was signed into effect in January. It's Chapter 338, Strengthening Gifted and Talented Education Act. And it has a couple of things that are new to New Jersey Administrative Code. This is the first time we've actually had a change in New Jersey since 2005. There are just a couple of things that we can highlight. The definition of gifted kids. These are kids with a high level of ability in one or more content areas. And it's important that we compare them to their chronological peers, not to their national peers or necessarily same grade level peers. And these are kids who require modifications to their programs if they're to achieve in accordance with their abilities. It talks about appropriate instructional adaptations. These are modifications to the curriculum and perhaps even full-on programming options for these kids. The other thing that's new and really important is that it is now, it must be documented by districts that there's a K-12 identification process and K-12 services. And the ID process must include multiple measures, and it must identify students in terms of intellectual ability, creativity, or a specific academic area. It also ensures that students get equal access. We're talking about kids who are typically underrepresented, twice exceptional, English language learners, and more. And it recommends districts look at providing a continuum of services and not have a one-size-fits-all program. There are a couple of other things in here that are accountability measures. One is a transparency measure. Districts must provide information about their identification and services on their website. Has to be transparent, and then administrators must provide a report to the Department of Ed every year on who are the kids that are being identified, who are the teachers that are servicing these kids, and what are the measures that are used. It also talks about professional development opportunities that administrators need to provide. So that's really a quick overview of the law. It's definitely on the Department of Ed website for further review. So let's dive a little bit deeper and talk about who the gifted kids are. Who are the kids we're trying to look for? What are some of the traits that we're looking for? So I have a couple of things here and a couple of things highlighted or asterisks to focus on. These are students who are the abstract thinkers, the ones who ask, well, what if? They're conceptual thinkers. They tend to have high levels of moral judgment. These are the kids who are intensely aware of what's fair and what's not. They also tend to develop asynchronously, so they may be intellectually above their peers but can't tie their shoes or can't organize their backpacks or just are emotionally immature. And that can be deceiving for some people working with these students. They're also intensely curious about a wide variety of things. They can also be highly energetic. And that sort of relates to a conceptual theory called overexcitabilities, Dabrowski's overexcitabilities. These are kids who are emotionally intense and physically energetic. They can be crazy creative. They show exceptional ingenuity. They use, for example, you're a STEM teacher. These are kids who have their own little STEM labs, typically in their homes, where they're taking things apart and putting things back together all the time. Their sense of humor can be sophisticated, above their grade level peers. They can have an intense commitment to their work. If they're really interested as second graders in dinosaurs, there's very little you can do to get them off of that. But they may not be at all interested in learning how to spell second grade words. They ask a ton of questions. They have insatiable curiosity, and they can persevere when it is interesting to them. So these are some of the traits. Teachers typically, when they're identifying gifted students for programs in public schools, will have checklists that include some of these traits. So there are some other traits that are associated with giftedness as well. According to the research, these can also be 2E kids, twice exceptional. They can be gifted and have specific learning disabilities. Emotional disorders, they can be ADHD or ADD. They can be on the spectrum. They can have other health impairments. They can be perceptually disabled, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. There can be all kinds of things going on with these students. They can have 504s and IEPs and should not be overlooked because they have those other exceptionalities. They can be these culturally and linguistically diverse kids. We get a lot of ELLs coming in that are not necessarily identified because of the language barriers, but we need to consider those students as well. And as I said, they can be hypersensitive, they can be perfectionists, which can be a serious problem. They can also be underachievers, and they can have that syndrome called imposter syndrome, where they really have these abilities, but they don't think that they do, and so they underachieve because they don't think that they're capable. I'm going to just check very quickly to make sure that there is nobody else in the waiting room. And I don't see that there is, so I apologize. I'm going to go back now. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these gifted Ls. They can be identified. They're often not identified, but these are kids who may exhibit traits that are more sophisticated and more mature than their age peers because of their cultural backgrounds. They may be given more responsibilities at home and may exhibit more maturity than their age peers. Their brains work differently because they are bilingual usually, maybe even trilingual. But because they have problems in English, it's not their first language necessarily. They may not exhibit the same kinds of traits as our native speakers. And so they may not perform well on standardized tests. They may not perform on some of the gifted screening tools. So we have to be specifically looking for these students. Often parents of gifted Ls aren't even aware of gifted programming or testing for identification. And so the school districts really need to be conscious about getting information out to these parents in their native languages. Another challenge with gifted Ls is teachers who work with them need to be trained not only in gifted pedagogy, but to really understand the psychometry, the testing that's given, and how gifted Ls perform on such tests. And please feel free to jump in with any questions that you have along the way, because I'm more than happy to stop and explain things more or answer specific questions. So let's talk about how we identify these kids. Some of the best practices include using multiple measures. In other words, we shouldn't just use one test or one type of a test to find these kids because kids may have a bad day, they may not test well. One test should not disqualify a student. We want to use local norms. Depending on the district, and Madison is very much like the district that I worked in. It's high socioeconomic, high performing students. If you're using national norms, a lot of your students are going to perform really well if you compare them to the national norms. That's not to say that they're not gifted, but they are definitely high achieving. But you want to find the kids in your own district who are the outliers, and using local norms is the way to do that. You want to make sure that you use checklists, parent, teacher, peer checklists that are culturally sensitive and allow for non-English speaking or underrepresented students to show their skills, including a lot of observations and checklists. We want to have a mix of subjective and objective criteria. Subjective meaning report card grades, teacher checklists, parent identification checklists, peer nominations. Those are subjective. They're based on people's opinions. And objective meaning, their test scores. And we'll talk about these more in depth. Another thing that's really important is that we identify first, and then we provide services. So we want to match the services to students' needs. Once you're identifying the students and you find out what their skill sets are, then you figure out what they need. Do they need math acceleration? Do they need creativity? Do they need a reading or a writing program? So I identify first, provide services after. And the Department of Ed and the New Jersey Association for Gifted Children and the National Association for Gifted Children are trying hard to advocate for resisting labeling students as gifted or not gifted. We'd like to say that they need services just as other students in maybe special ed, kids who need OT, PT. We provide services based on their need. Okay. Excuse me, so let's talk a little bit about some of the screening tools and measures. Ability tests and achievement tests are typically where we begin with identifying these kids. Ability meaning these are what students are capable of, right? Achievement meaning they're typically lower ceiling tests. They measure what a student has been able to learn in terms of specific skills. Ability shows potential. Achievement shows performance. So I'm going to just give you a quick look at a couple of these. You are going to receive more information about these later. Let's talk about some of the ability tests. One of the best ones is the SAGES, which is the screening assessment for gifted, I'm not sure if you can see this page, for gifted elementary and middle school students. There are two different versions. There's a K-3 and there's a 4-8, and it's a test of analogies. You may be able to see on here how this is formatted. It's nonverbal. It's been updated recently. It looks like this particular one's not available. It's been updated recently. It had been in desperate need of updating for a while, and they've redone it recently and updated the pictures so that they're more kid-friendly. But it's a great way to see how kids make connections in their critical thinking. And it's normed in two different ways. You can score this according to scoring kids according to average ability. In other words, students are compared with their age peers. It can also be normed according to gifted scales, in which the students who take the test are scored against identified gifted students. And I highly recommend the SAGES. The other is the OLSAT, the Otis Lennon.
Which norm would you recommend? Like, how do you decide which norm to use?
That's a great question. So I've always used the gifted norms. I've actually always scored it both ways. But for programming and services, I use the gifted norms. Again, because when I was using this test, I worked in a district that had super high achieving kids. And so when I have both norms, I have the scores for the gifted, I know that those kids are really above and beyond. The average norms, or I forget what the exact term is, I think it's normal norms. That can be helpful too if you're trying to provide other services. For example, using that scale can show you kids who may need some enrichment, right, in some general enrichment. But the gifted scale for sort of a general gifted program, I think, is the better way to go. Does that help? Okay. All right, going back to the Otis Lennon. This is, a lot of districts will use an Otis Lennon sort of as a universal screening test. In other words, they will give this test or the COGAT to all students at a particular grade. For example, grade 2, everyone gets the COGAT or everyone gets the OLSAT. They may do it in grade 2, they may do it for students who are new to the district. They may also give this in grade 5, just to make sure that they're not missing anybody. And these can be hand scored or they can be sent out for a price, of course, but they're also really great at finding those critical thinkers and those students who show that they need more than what the regular classroom can provide. The NNAT, the Naglieri, is nonverbal, and a lot of districts will use that. In the child study team will use this one. It kind of gives you an IQ sort of score, but because it's nonverbal, it's great for the English language learners and for non-readers. So this is another great abilities test. So any of these actually can be done as universal screening. Give them to everybody, get a baseline test on everyone, test students who are new to the district as they come in, and test them again in another grade. There's usually a memory issue with it. They usually don't allow you to give these tests more than once within a year period. But second and fifth are sort of a standard for administering these tests. So, and you will quickly see your outliers with the results on those. So another screening tool to use, or a screening mechanism, would be to do achievement tests. And most districts are already using achievement tests anyway. You may be doing STAR, you may be doing iReady, maybe you're doing, districts use the NJSLA, although I don't necessarily recommend that one. The SAGES has achievement tests. They have a combination language arts and social studies and a combination math and science, in addition to the reasoning subtest. And those are pretty excellent measures as well. The TOMAGS is the test of mathematical ability for gifted students. This one I would highly recommend. I know it's math specific, but after having given this, it's grades K through 6, after having administered that test for years and finding those outlier students, I can safely say that it's an excellent measure of students' math ability. It's like the SAGES in that it has two ways of norming it, the normal norms and the gifted norms. And just as a quick example, I had a group of students who were in first grade taking the TOMAGs, who on the normal sample were at the 99th percentile. In the gifted sample, they were the 99th percentile. These students were, by the time they got to grade 5, were in Algebra 1. By the time they were in grade 8, they were in calculus at the high school. So it's a really great measure of finding those kids with outstanding abilities. Really reliable data. So the MAP growth and the Iowa are other sorts of achievement tests that can be given. I can't overstate the importance of using one from each of these categories. It's important to see what the students are able to perform and what their potential is. If you just use an achievement test, you're missing out on finding out what the students are capable of. So also important would be using subjective criteria. Not all students perform well on tests. Some have test anxiety, or even just a kid may have a bad day, right? Dog died last night, didn't get enough sleep, just may not do well on a test. So as a safety net for finding these students, let's look at some subjective criteria. Teacher and parent input, one way to do that. There are a couple of different rating scales. The Purdue rating scales, I'm going to click on the link. This one takes us to a PDF. So it's based on specific subject matter, and the teacher scores this on a 1 to 4 scale if the student rarely or seldom displays the characteristic, all the way up to displays it almost always or all the time. And so you're looking for certain behaviors. The nice thing about this is the school can decide on their measure. They may want to say that a student has to have, out of all 15 items, may have to have all 15. Maybe may have to have 4 points times 15, or may have to have 4 points times 10 items. The school can decide what they think is the way to go with that one. A really popular one, although it can be quite complex, there are modified ones. This is the scales for rating the behavioral characteristics of gifted or superior students. This is by Renzulli, who is the absolute guru in gifted ed, has been studying and researching gifted ed since the 1970s. This one's really comprehensive, and it will allow you to rate behavioral traits of kids in a variety of categories, including creativity and leadership, motivation, achievement. So this is another really great rating scale, and it should be filled out by teachers and multiple teachers, not just a classroom teacher. Give these rating scales to the art teacher and the PE teacher, and really anyone who has an opportunity to interact with a student. And it should be emphasized that parents know their kids best. They may not have the research base, but they know their students' traits, and getting parent input is really important. There's the Kingar Observation Inventory, which is done throughout a school year. Needs to be purchased, but it's incredibly valuable. Goes all the way up to grade 8. And so you kind of, sort of like running records, you monitor students' behaviors and their traits throughout the school year. And the Whitmore is for underachievers. And it's like the Purdue in that a school can decide on their scoring mechanism for this one. And you'll have access to all of these as well. Are we okay so far? Any questions? Okay, so we're going to move on. Talk about creativity. Because creativity is now cited in the law, it's really important that we address it. There are a couple of behavioral scales here. One is the profile of creative abilities, and the other is the scales for rating the behavioral characteristics. There is a creativity sub-scale within that mechanism to use. The Torrance is, kids love to take the Torrance test because it's like a game. Students are asked to draw, to write, to create, to make cartoons. And there's a pretty complex scoring mechanism that goes with this that allows the teacher to rate students on things like their fluent thinking, how many ideas can they come up with, their flexible thinking, how many ways can you look at things in new and unusual ways, their originality, and how well they can elaborate or enhance an idea. I will tell you the Torrance takes a little bit of time to score by hand, but it can be sent out as well. And profile of creative abilities is another one. I would say that the creativity test, the achievement test, the abilities test, and the subjective rating scale should all be part of your identification process. So having talked about all of the identification, it should be mentioned that it's important to help students who may never have experienced any of these tests to sort of not prepare for them, but to be exposed to the type of thinking that they will see in some of these screening tools. So that could mean having the teacher of gifted go into every classroom. K-2 would certainly be the place to start, and just provide enrichment opportunities and allow students to have the chance to show what they know. And it could even be as simple as training classroom teachers to give students these experiences, to differentiate the curriculum, to give them challenges, to maybe show that they can compact out of a particular lesson or unit in social studies or in language arts or in math. Giving students an opportunity to show that they've got talent is a really important component of this as well. So let's move on to talk about services and programming. And again, just stop me if you have any questions. So there are a lot of different options for providing services for our students. And it can be as simple as beginning with some differentiated instruction in the classroom. And it can be as complex as whole grade acceleration or dual enrollment in a college or a university. So let's just talk about a couple of different options. Cluster grouping is the practice of taking identified gifted students and putting them together in a self-contained classroom with other students, with a teacher who has some training in gifted. The idea is that those students then become a cohort and they can work together on projects and curriculum and can stay together. This is a great practice because students who are identified as needing these services tend to have social emotional needs that can be addressed by having them work together. If they're with their intellectual peers, social emotional issues can become less problematic. Internships, mentorships, this can be done at any grade level. I've had science/mothers come in and work with my students on we learned cardiology, we learned marine biology, we did a neurology unit. Having a mentor come in with that level of expertise, a practicing professional coming in and doing isolated lessons or a unit of lessons is incredibly helpful. You may find parents in your community who could devote an hour a month to working with these students who may have an interest in a topic that the teacher has no knowledge on, and this mentor could help guide the student to a research project or an independent genius hour kind of a project. So getting community folks to come in is incredibly helpful. It's beneficial for both. Teaching strategies, compacting and differentiation are great. However, I would caution that those alone are not enough. And differentiation is a really hard practice to do well without a lot of training and support. Another option is competitions and tournaments. And there are tons of academic competitions out there. And students who are identified often thrive in a competitive environment. So offering those to students, it's fairly easy to do, and students tend to love that kind of opportunity. There are lots of math competitions, there are STEM competitions, there are novel writing competitions as well. Accommodations in the classroom, we talked about differentiation and compacting, but teachers can also do flexible grouping, right? Allow students to not necessarily work in cooperative groups. Students identified as gifted often have a hard time working in cooperative groups. They are either the kids who want to work, who want to do all the work, or let somebody else do all the work and really get frustrated with other students. They have a hard time working with other kids. That's not to say that they shouldn't have that experience, but giving them an opportunity to work with different levels of students, flexibly grouping them is really important. Socratic Seminars, giving students the opportunity to think critically about real world issues is very important. These students tend to have deep thoughts about what's happening in the world, and giving them this chance to really discuss what's happening and what solutions might be is a great idea. You can accelerate by grade or subject. I've had students who are in grade 4 go to grade 6 for math and take all the rest of their classes with their age level peers, or I've also had students who have skipped a grade or 2, and those are really great options. Teachers tend to get a little nervous about grade skipping, but the research does sort of advocate for that. When you balance out the cost and benefit of social emotional needs, acceleration wins. And gifted seminars, these would be classes, maybe marking period long classes on a topic. Maybe students engage for a marking period on a unit in architecture or in STEM of some sort, or maybe a writing seminar. It's just a way of exposing students to things that they wouldn't normally get in sort of a short-term situation. So I have a couple of districts that you might want to take a look at. One is in Pennsylvania. Orange is it's a unique one, and because you're a STEM teacher, you may be interested in this one. Orange does something called Scholars Academy. They have 3 different ways of meeting the needs of students. One is through a STEM program, one's through a specifically science program, and one is through a specific math program. It's an identified program. Students go from their home school and meet with the GT teacher and do project-based learning in that particular arena. The Roselle Schools is also a great program, K through 8, but they also have a high school program. And that district has a lot of diversity, so they do a great job of meeting the needs of English language learners and those typically underrepresented kids. If you were to go to some of these websites, you might also find that they have their identification processes online that you can examine to see if there may be some elements that you can use for your own district. So let's move on. I guess the most important thing here to know is that kids who are gifted, they're not just gifted for the pull-out program, 45 minutes a week, right? They don't just exhibit their talents when they go to their advanced math class. They need different services in order to achieve what they're capable of. And so it's important to recognize that not only should we identify and serve them, and ideally with a person who is trained in gifted pedagogy, but that every teacher who interacts with these students is really a teacher of the gifted. Everyone really does need to understand what the traits are, what these kids need, what their social and emotional needs are, and how they can challenge them so that they can meet their potential. Teacher training is really important, and it is a part of the law. Administrators should be looking to bring in professionals to help teachers with the identification process, with understanding the intersectionality of their affective needs and their cognitive needs. They need to understand how these students learn, how maybe just 1 or 2 repetitions and they've got it, and they don't necessarily need to do every worksheet and complete every assignment. Teacher training is really, really important. One thing to consider is having the INRS team also develop a list of strategies that teachers can use with these students. So when you're doing an INRS meeting, maybe there are things that can be distributed to the teachers. Maybe there can be a discussion on what teachers can do within their classrooms that are simple and easy, that may make a difference for the kids.